There are three kinds of men in this world: those who choose love, those who choose money, and those who think they can have both without paying the price. The letter arrived on a Tuesday that smelled like snow and regret, delivered by a courier who wouldn't meet Wanda's eyes. She recognized the handwriting before she saw the return address, Christopher's careful script, the same penmanship that had once written love letters, now reduced to legal communications. Avon looked up from her calculus homework at the kitchen table, her 18-year-old intuition sharp as her grandmother's. College acceptance letter. Something like that, Wanda said, slipping the envelope into her apron pocket. Some truths required careful timing, and this one had waited 10 years. It could wait until after dinner. But as she watched her daughter, their daughter, bend back over equations that would soon carry her to MIT, Wanda's mind traveled backward to another Tuesday, another letter, another choice that had changed everything. 18 years earlier. Bloomfield Hills. The champagne flutes caught Detroit's winter sunset like crystal promises, each bubble rising towards surfaces that would never be touched. Wanda Milner-Slough moved through her mansion's kitchen with the precision of a woman orchestrating her own execution, arranging white roses in Waterford crystal while humming "Isn't She Lovely?", the Stevie Wonder song her grandmother had crooned over 4 generations of babies. 3 years of marriage deserved celebration. The pregnancy test hidden in her Hermes bag deserved announcement. But the manila envelope Christopher had left on the Marble Island that morning suggested neither celebration nor joy lay ahead. She'd found it at 6:47 a.m., positioned exactly where he left his coffee cup each morning, centered, deliberate, impossible to ignore, her name written in his careful script across cream-colored law firm stationery. Inside, 47 pages that could be summarized in 4 words: irreconcilable differences, effective immediately. The irony wasn't lost on her. On the same morning she'd planned to tell him about their baby, he'd decided their marriage was worth less than his board's comfort. "You knew this could happen," whispered the voice that sounded like her mother. "Rich white men don't keep black wives when it stops being profitable." But she'd fought that voice for 3 years, believing love could conquer spreadsheets and stock prices. Believing the man who'd traced her grandmother's quilt patterns with reverent fingers understood what he was trying to erase. The front door slammed with the particular violence of a man who'd already mentally moved out. Christopher's footsteps across Italian marble lacked their usual confident rhythm. These were the steps of someone walking toward a conversation he'd choreographed but dreaded performing. "Wanda?" His voice carried the hollow ring of boardroom authority, the tone he used for quarterly reports and personnel terminations. She continued arranging roses, each stem a small act of defiance. "Dinner's ready. I made your favorite. We need to discuss the papers." What papers? The lie sat bitter on her tongue, but she wanted to hear him say it, wanted him to speak aloud the choice between her and money that he'd already made in the privacy of his lawyer's office. "You found the envelope." "I found many things this morning." She turned to face him, one hand instinctively moving to protect her still flat stomach. "The question is whether you're brave enough to discuss all of them." Something flickered across his face, uncertainty, maybe guilt, but corporate training reasserted itself quickly. "The board held an emergency session yesterday about our situation." "Our situation?" She laughed, sharp and bitter as winter wind. "Is that what they're calling your wife now? A situation to be managed? They're calling it a liability." The words fell like stones into still water. A distraction from company focus, something that affects investor confidence. "Because I'm black. Because the optics. Because I'm black." She repeated it like a mantra, like a truth that needed witnessing. "Because having a black wife makes you look dangerous to white money. Because loving me publicly costs you privately." He couldn't meet her eyes, this man who'd once sworn he'd fight the world for her. "It's more complicated than that." No, Christopher, it's exactly that simple. She moved toward him, close enough to see the sweat beading his forehead despite December's chill. You've calculated the cost of keeping me versus the profit of discarding me, and I'm not worth enough to damage your portfolio. That's not, I never said, you didn't have to say it. She gestured toward the envelope, toward the 47 pages that reduced 3 years of marriage to financial terms and asset division. You put it in writing, with witnesses and notarization. The baby fluttered in her womb, too small to feel but present enough to change everything. She could tell him now, could watch his face transform as mathematics gave way to biology, as shareholder concerns collided with paternal instinct. But looking at him, at this man who'd just chosen money over love, image over substance, other people's comfort over his own wife, she couldn't speak the words. A man who would abandon her for being black would abandon their child for being mixed. A man who prioritized board meetings over marriage vows didn't deserve to know about the life growing inside her. I see. She picked up the envelope, feeling its weight like lead in her hands. And you expect me to simply sign these papers and disappear quietly? I expect you to understand that this is business, not personal. But his voice cracked on the last word, revealing the man underneath the executive. Everything about marriage is personal, Christopher. Everything about love is personal. Everything about choosing fear over courage is deeply, devastatingly personal. She moved toward the door, each step deliberate as a funeral march. I'll have my lawyer review your business proposal, but let me be clear about something. She paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the soft glow of their anniversary dinner, the meal she'd prepared with love, the candles she'd lit with hope, the future she'd imagined that would never exist. You're not divorcing me because your board is racist. You're divorcing me because you're a coward, because you'd rather be rich and alone than brave and loved. Because when they asked you to choose between me and money, you didn't even hesitate. Wanda, please. The sad part is, you'll never know what you lost tonight. You'll never know the gift you threw away for stock options and shareholder approval. She climbed the stairs to pack her life into suitcases, leaving behind a man who thought he'd made a smart business decision and would spend the rest of his life discovering he'd made the biggest mistake of his existence. The pregnancy test remained in her purse, its secret safe. Some treasures were too precious to waste on unworthy recipients. Present day, Detroit. Mom? Avon's voice pulled Wanda back to the present, to the kitchen where her daughter, their daughter, was frowning at calculus problems that would soon carry her to college. Sorry, sweetheart, just wool gathering. About that letter. Wanda touched the envelope in her pocket, feeling the weight of 10 years and choices that had shaped everything that followed. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether Christopher Slow deserved to know what his cowardice had cost him. Tonight, she would watch her daughter solve equations with the same precision that had once helped Wanda solve the equation of survival after abandonment. Outside, Detroit's evening snow began to fall, covering the city in forgiveness it might not deserve but certainly needed. Some stories end where they begin, others begin where they should have ended long ago. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Leaving. Leaving a marriage is like dismantling a house. You keep the foundation stones that made you strong and burn everything that made you small. The snow had stopped, but the weight remained. Wanda stood at her bedroom window, watching Emery clear their driveway with the methodical patience that had first attracted her to him. Even in winter's harsh light, she could see the silver threading through his hair. 10 years of loving them had marked him in small, beautiful ways. Mom? Celine appeared in the doorway, 18 and fierce as spring lightning. Dad said you got a letter that's making you remember sad things. Wanda smiled despite the ache in her chest. Her daughters had always been able to read her like scripture. Not sad things exactly, complicated things. About our biological father? The question hung between them like suspended breath. They'd always known the truth, that the man who'd helped create them had chosen not to stay, that Emery was their father in every way that mattered. But 18 brought new questions, sharper curiosities about identity and origin. About choices, Wanda said carefully. About the difference between the family you're born to and the family you choose. Celine nodded with the wisdom of a young woman who'd never doubted her place in the world. Like how Dad chose us before he even met us. What do you mean? He told me once that he'd been waiting his whole life for a ready-made family. Said some people spend years trying to create something perfect, but he got to walk into something that was already whole. Wanda's throat tightened. Even after all these years, Emery could surprise her with the depth of his understanding. The letter, Celine continued. It's from him, isn't it? The other man. There was no point in lying. Yes. Does he want something? I don't know yet. I haven't opened it. Celine studied her mother's face with the penetrating gaze she'd inherited from both parents. Wanda's intuition and Christopher's analytical mind, though she'd never know about the latter. Do you want to? Did she? After 10 years of building a life so complete that his absence felt like an ancient scar rather than a fresh wound, did she want to know what Christopher Slough thought he could say? Part of me does, Wanda admitted. The part that still wonders what might have been different. And the other part? The other part knows that some doors should stay closed, that some people get to walk away but don't get to walk back. 18 years earlier, Bloomfield Hills. Dawn arrived like an executioner's reprieve, inevitable but unwelcome. Wanda had spent the night dismantling 3 years of marriage with surgical precision, each item sorted into categories that felt like emotional taxonomy. Taking grandmother's quilt, family photographs, her own dreams, leaving everything that smelled like his money, burning every gift that had been about his image rather than their love. The irony of packing her African art collection while he slept wasn't lost on her. He'd bought most of these pieces, Jacob Lawrence prints, a Kehinde Wiley portrait, sculptures by Richmond Barthay, trying to prove his appreciation for her culture. But appreciation and understanding were different languages, and she'd been the only one fluent in both. Her phone vibrated against the nightstand. A text from her sister Keisha. Coffee's ready. Come home when you're ready to stop being strong. Keisha had always possessed the ability to see through her sister's armor to the bruised heart underneath. 3 years older and infinitely wiser about men's capacity for disappointment, she'd been the only one to question Christopher's motivations from the beginning. Rich white boys don't marry us for love, she'd warned before the wedding. They marry us for the story they get to tell themselves about being progressive. But when the story costs them money, they'll rewrite the ending. Wanda had thought love would be different, had believed the man who'd spent hours learning to pronounce her grandmother's Yoruba blessing, who'd hung her family's portraits in places of honor, who'd sworn he'd rather lose everything than lose her, had meant what he said. But men, she was learning, could mean what they said in the moment and still change their minds when moments became expensive. The baby fluttered again. Stronger this time, as if protesting the stress hormones flooding Wanda's system. She placed both hands on her stomach, whispering apologies to the life that would grow up knowing only half its heritage. I'm going to tell you about your people, she murmured. About the great-grandmother who walked from Alabama to Detroit with nothing but determination and a sewing kit. About the grandfather who built houses with his hands and refused to bow to any man. About the women who raised children and businesses and hell when necessary. She wouldn't tell this child about shareholders and board meetings, about love that came with price tags and conditions. Some stories were inheritance, others were cautionary tales. The sound of Christopher's shower running meant her time was limited. He'd emerge with wet hair and corporate armor, ready to discuss logistics and transition timelines, as if their marriage was a failed merger rather than a broken promise. But first, she had a ritual to complete. In the kitchen, she removed every trace of the anniversary dinner she'd prepared with such hope. The herb-crusted lamb went down the disposal in pieces, each grinding sound a small satisfaction. The chocolate soufflé followed, then the wine she'd chosen to toast their future. Let him find empty refrigerator shelves and clean counters. Let him understand that some erasures were mutual. The front door chimed, a delivery she'd forgotten about. The florist stood on the porch with 24 white roses, the same flowers she'd arranged yesterday for a celebration that had become a funeral. For Mrs. Slough, the young man said, consulting his clipboard. She doesn't live here anymore, Wanda replied, closing the door on his confusion and the flowers' mocking beauty. By the time Christopher emerged, showered, shaved, and prepared for another day of choosing money over love, she was loading the last box into her car. Wanda, wait. He stood in the doorway, wearing the silk robe she'd given him for Christmas, looking younger and more uncertain than she'd seen him since their wedding day. We should talk about this rationally. Rationally? She laughed, sharp and bright as breaking glass. You want to rationally discuss how you rationally decided that loving me was irrational for your career? It's about exactly what it's about, Christopher. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. She climbed into her car. The same reliable Honda she'd driven before marriage transformed her into the wife of a millionaire. It felt like coming home to herself. I'll have my lawyer contact yours about the details, she said through the open window. But let me be clear about something. You don't get to be noble about this. You don't get to pretend this was hard for you. You calculated the cost of keeping me versus the profit of discarding me, and your calculator was very clear about which option made more sense. That's exactly what it is. She started the engine, the Honda's reliable purr, a comfort after 3 years of luxury cars that had never felt like hers. You made your choice, Christopher. Now live with it. The drive from Bloomfield Hills to Detroit took 37 minutes, but it felt like traveling between worlds. Suburban mansions gave way to urban resilience, careful lawns surrendered to community gardens, and the quiet desperation of keeping up appearances transformed into the loud hope of people building something from nothing. Her phone rang as she crossed 8 Mile, the invisible line that separated white money from black survival. Christopher's name appeared on the screen, but she let it ring through to voicemail. Some conversations were finished before they ended. Detroit welcomed her back with snow-dusted streets and the smell of community, coffee shops and barber shops, churches and corner stores where people knew each other's names and children. This was the neighborhood where she'd learned that strength came not from what you accumulated, but from what you survived. Keisha was waiting on the porch of their childhood home, arms open wide and judgment suspended. Welcome home, baby sister. For the first time in 24 hours, Wanda let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from relief. Relief that she didn't have to be perfect anymore, didn't have to represent her entire race in board meetings and charity galas, didn't have to make herself smaller to fit into spaces that had never been designed for her. I'm pregnant, she whispered against her sister's shoulder. Keisha pulled back to study her face, reading the story written in Wanda's eyes. He knows. He forfeited the right to know. Good. Keisha's voice carried the fierce protectiveness that had shielded Wanda through childhood. Some men get to be sperm donors, others get to be fathers. He made his choice. Present day, Detroit. Mom? Celine's voice pulled Wanda back to the present. You're smiling. Am I? The same way you smile when you watch Dad shovel snow, like you're remembering something beautiful. Wanda looked out the window again, where Emery was finishing the driveway with characteristic thoroughness. He'd started this ritual the first winter they'd lived together, insisting that his girls shouldn't have to walk through snow to get to the car. 10 years later, he still cleared every flake as if their comfort was his sacred duty. "I'm remembering the day I realized the difference between a man who says he loves you and a man who shows it," Wanda said. "And the letter." Wanda pulled the envelope from her pocket, studying the handwriting that had once written promises on anniversary cards, and now wrote, what? Apologies, demands, regrets too little and too late. "The letter is about the past," she said, "but our life is about the future." She walked to her dresser and placed the envelope in the bottom drawer, beneath the quilt her grandmother had made, and the ultrasound photos from 10 years ago that had shown 2 heartbeats instead of 1. Some letters were meant to be opened immediately. Others were meant to wait until you were strong enough to read them without breaking. And some perhaps were meant to remind you how far you'd traveled from the woman who'd once believed love could conquer arithmetic. Outside, Emery finished shoveling and looked up at their bedroom window, finding her face in the glass. He smiled and blew her a kiss across the distance, the same gesture he'd made every morning for 10 years, as reliable as sunrise and twice as warming. Christopher Slough could keep his letters and regrets. She had a family to love in the present tense. Chapter 3. 2 Hearts, 1 Future. Some children are born into the world like questions waiting for answers. Others arrive like answers to prayers you didn't know you were praying. The twins found Wanda in the kitchen at midnight, drawn by the light under the door, and the intuition that connected all 3 of them like emotional radar. At 18, Avon and Celine had perfected the art of silent communication. A tilt of the head, a shared glance, a decision made without words. "Can't sleep either?" Avon asked, settling at the kitchen table where she'd done homework for 10 years. "The letter's keeping you awake," Celine added, direct as always. She'd inherited Christopher's analytical mind and Wanda's emotional intelligence, though she'd never know about the former. Wanda turned from the stove, where she was warming milk with honey and cinnamon, her grandmother's remedy for restless nights and troubled hearts. "What makes you think there's a letter?" "Because you've been touching your apron pocket all evening," Avon observed. "And because you get that same look every year around this time, like you're remembering something beautiful and terrible at the same time." The twins exchanged another look, the wordless conversation of children who'd never had to compete for love or attention, who'd been raised as partners rather than rivals. "It's him, isn't it?" Celine said. "The man who helped make us but never chose to know us." Wanda poured 3 cups of spiced milk, buying time to find words that could hold truth without causing pain. "What do you know about him?" "Only what you've told us," Avon said carefully. "That he wasn't ready to be a father. That sometimes people aren't brave enough for the love they're offered. And that we're better off without him," Celine added, with the certainty of a young woman who'd never doubted her worth. "Because we got Dad instead." The simple truth of it, spoken without bitterness or curiosity about what might have been, made Wanda's chest tighten with pride and relief. Her daughters had never felt like half of anything. They'd grown up whole, complete, secure in the knowledge that they were wanted exactly as they were. "Tell us about the day we were born," Avon requested, settling into the story like a familiar blanket. "The real version, not the pretty one." 18 years earlier, Detroit Medical Center. The first contraction seized Wanda at 3:17 a.m. on a February morning when Detroit was locked in winter's final, desperate grip. She'd been lying in the narrow bed of her studio apartment, one hand on her swollen belly, feeling the twins perform their nightly acrobatics. Avon methodical in her movements, Celine dramatic in her protests against confinement. Keisha. She reached for her phone with steady hands. Her sister had been sleeping on the pull-out couch for 2 weeks, refusing to leave Wanda alone as her due date approached. It's time. Within minutes, Keisha materialized with the calm efficiency of someone trained to handle crises. As a social worker, she'd seen every possible family configuration and understood that love came in forms that law and tradition often failed to recognize. "You ready to meet your daughters?" Keisha asked, helping Wanda into the coat they'd bought at Goodwill, practical, warm, and nothing like the designer maternity clothes Christopher's money could have provided. "I've been ready for 7 months," Wanda replied, though part of her heart ached for what should have been: nervous grandparents flying in from distant cities, a father pacing the waiting room, friends sending flowers and balloons. Instead, it was just her and Keisha, creating their own fierce definition of family. The drive to Detroit Medical Center passed through neighborhoods that held 4 generations of black women's stories. Women who'd delivered babies during the Great Migration, who'd raised children on assembly line wages, who'd built beauty from whatever materials they could gather. This was where Wanda belonged, among people who understood that strength was inherited and survival was a collaborative art. Dr. Patricia Williams waited in labor and delivery with the warm authority of a woman who'd helped bring countless children into the world. She'd been Wanda's choice specifically, a black obstetrician who understood that birth was both medical event and cultural passage. "Ready to do this?" Dr. Williams asked, and something in her tone suggested she knew this birth was about more than bringing babies into the world. It was about proving that love could flourish without the approval of men who calculated its worth. Labor progressed with the intensity of a summer storm, sudden, overwhelming, transformative. Wanda had refused all pain medication, wanting to feel every sensation, to experience the full power of bringing life from her body. Each contraction was a reminder of her strength, her ability to create something beautiful from something broken. "Tell me about the gallery," Keisha said during a brief respite, helping Wanda focus on the future she was building. "Paint me the picture." "High ceilings," Wanda gasped between contractions, "natural light flooding through tall windows, art by people who look like us, telling stories that need telling, a place where our children can see themselves reflected in beauty. And the girls will grow up there, surrounded by creativity and culture and pride. They'll know where they come from, who they are." Another contraction gripped her, stronger than before. They'll never have to make themselves smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for them. Hours passed in a rhythm of breathing and pushing, of Keisha's steady voice and Dr. Williams' expert guidance. But underneath the physical work was emotional archaeology. Wanda was excavating the parts of herself that Christopher's rejection had buried, reclaiming the woman who'd existed before she'd tried to fit into his world. "I can see the first baby," Dr. Williams announced. "Here comes your daughter." Avon entered the world with the quiet dignity that would characterize her entire life, alert, observant, as if she were already taking note of everything she'd need to know. She was perfect in the way that made time stop and hearts expand beyond their known capacity. "She's beautiful," Keisha whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Look at those eyes. She's going to see everything." "She looks like my mother," Wanda said, cradling her firstborn against her chest. "Strong and wise and ready for whatever comes." 22 minutes later, Celine announced her arrival with the dramatic flair that would become her signature, a cry that filled the delivery room like an opera singer claiming her stage. Where Avon was contemplative, Celine was expressive, her tiny fists waving as if she were already prepared to fight for her place in the world. "Twins," Dr. Williams said, placing Celine beside her sister on Wanda's chest. "Two beautiful, healthy girls." Looking down at her daughters, Wanda felt a completeness that had nothing to do with Christopher's absence and everything to do with their presence. These children were hers entirely, not shared with a man who'd chosen money over love, not complicated by divided loyalties or conditional acceptance. "What about the father on the birth certificates?" the nurse asked, with practiced gentleness. "Father unknown," Wanda said without hesitation. It was the literal truth in every way that mattered. A father was someone who chose to be present, who loved without conditions, who put children's needs before personal comfort. Christopher Slough had forfeited that title before these babies had even been born. The nurse made the notation without comment. This was Detroit, where single motherhood was often a testimony to strength rather than a mark of failure, where communities raised children when individual men chose to disappear. Over the next hours, as Wanda nursed her daughters and marveled at their perfect features, she began to see glimpses of who they would become. Avon was peaceful, content to observe her new world with intelligent consideration. Celine was more demanding, wanting immediate attention and comfort, her personality already blazing through her tiny form. "They're going to be extraordinary," Keisha said, gently stroking Avon's cheek while Celine fussed for more milk. "They're going to know they're loved," Wanda promised with fierce certainty. "Every single day, they'll know they're wanted and treasured exactly as they are." Present day, Detroit. "And then what happened?" Celine asked, though she'd heard this story dozens of times. "Then the whole world changed," Wanda said, sipping her spiced milk and watching her daughters' faces in the kitchen light. "Suddenly I wasn't a woman who'd been left behind. I was a mother with a purpose. I was 3 people instead of 1. "And you were never lonely?" Avon asked with the perceptiveness that had marked her since birth. "How could I be lonely with you two? You filled every empty space I didn't even know I had." "But weren't you scared?" Celine pressed. "About money and daycare and raising us alone?" Wanda considered lying, offering the sanitized version where everything had been perfect from the beginning. But her daughters deserved the truth. That strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "Terrified," she admitted, "but I was also determined. I knew I could give you something more valuable than money. I could give you the absolute certainty that you were wanted, that you belonged, that your mixed heritage wasn't something to hide, but something to celebrate." "Is that why you never tried to find him?" Avon asked. "Because you wanted us to be certain about belonging?" "I never tried to find him because I never lost him," Wanda replied. "You can't lose something you never really had. He was never your father. He was just the man who helped create you. There's a difference." "And Dad?" Celine smiled. "When did he become Dad?" "The moment he chose us," Wanda said simply. "The moment he looked at 3 broken hearts and decided we were worth healing. The moment he proved that family isn't about biology, it's about showing up." The twins nodded with the satisfaction of children who'd never doubted this truth. They'd grown up knowing that Emery Claymore was their father in every way that mattered, that chosen love was often stronger than accidental connection. "So the letter," Avon said carefully, "from the man who helped make us. What do you think he wants?" Wanda touched her apron pocket, feeling the weight of 10 years and choices that had shaped everything. "I think he wants something he gave up the right to want. I think he's finally figured out what he lost." "Are you going to answer?" "I'm going to read it first. Then I'm going to remember that some doors once closed should stay that way." She stood to rinse her cup, her decision crystallizing like the snow falling outside. "And then I'm going to keep living the life I built from the ashes of his cowardice." "Good," Celine said with characteristic directness, "because we have Dad, and we have you, and we have each other. We don't need anything else." Avon nodded agreement, then added with a wisdom beyond her years, "Besides, the best parents are the ones who choose you every day, not the ones who just happen to make you." Outside, Detroit slept under its blanket of snow, the city dreaming its dreams of resurrection and renewal. Inside, three women who'd been born from abandonment but raised on love continued the conversation that would last their lifetimes. About belonging, about choosing family, about the difference between men who father children and men who raise them. Some stories begin with loss. Others begin with the decision to turn loss into strength, abandonment into independence, broken promises into unbreakable bonds. Christopher Slough's letter could wait until morning. Tonight belonged to the family he'd never deserved to know. Chapter 4. The Language of Chosen Love. Real love doesn't announce itself with grand gestures. It whispers itself through 1,000 small choices spoken in the dialect of daily devotion. Sunday morning arrived with the ritual precision that had anchored the Claymore family for 8 years. Wanda stood at her grandmother's cast-iron stove, stirring grits with the wooden spoon that had fed 4 generations of strong black women, while Detroit's church bells called the faithful to worship they'd attend later. But first, there was this, the sacred space of family breakfast, where love was spoken in the language of brown butter and perfectly seasoned eggs. "Mom, you're humming Stevie Wonder again," Celine observed from the table where she was supposed to be reviewing her college application essays, but was instead building abstract sculptures from her orange slices. At 18, she'd retained the creative restlessness that had marked her since birth. "Isn't she lovely?" Avon identified, without looking up from her calculus textbook. Even during family breakfast, she absorbed knowledge like a sponge, her mind already reaching toward the MIT acceptance letter that would arrive any day. "You always hum it when you're thinking about the day we were born." Emery emerged from his study carrying the essays he'd been grading since dawn, 43 papers about dreams and disappointments from students who saw education as their only escape route from poverty. At 48, he moved with the steady grace of a man who'd found his purpose in lifting others. "Morning, beautiful women," he said, kissing each of them in turn. Wanda's lips, then the tops of his daughters' heads with the casual affection of someone who'd never had to earn the right to love them. "Dad, settle an argument," Celine said, abandoning her orange slice architecture. "Mom thinks I should write my Harvard essay about overcoming adversity, but I don't think we've had any real adversity to overcome." Wanda paused in her stirring, touched by her daughter's innocence. Celine had grown up so secure in love that she couldn't recognize the adversity they'd conquered simply by becoming the family they were. "What do you think adversity looks like?" Emery asked, with the gentle probing of an educator who knew the best learning came through discovery. "I don't know. Poverty? Abuse? Parents on drugs?" Celine gestured around their comfortable kitchen, not wealthy, but abundant with love and stability. "We've had this. We've had each other. We've had you showing up every day like it was your job to love us." "It is my job to love you," Emery said simply, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of a man who'd found his calling. "Best job I ever had." 10 years earlier, Corktown Gallery opening. The scent of possibility hung in the air, turpentine and fresh paint, wine and hope. Wanda moved through her gallery on opening night, checking details with nervous energy. The Milner Gallery occupied a converted warehouse in Corktown, all exposed brick and soaring ceilings. 5 years of planning, 3 years of renovation, every dollar invested in creating something that had never existed, a space where black art could be celebrated. "Mama, can we touch the sculptures?" 8-year-old Avon asked, standing before a bronze piece with reverence. "This one, yes," Wanda said, guiding her daughter's hands to the smooth curves. "Art isn't always meant to be distant." "Wanda Milner?" She turned to find a tall black man with kind eyes and professor's posture. "It's Claymore now. And you are?" "Emery Claymore," he said with a smile. "No relation." though if I were going to share a name with someone, I couldn't have chosen better. They talked for hours as the crowd thinned and the twins fell asleep on the vintage couch. Their conversation flowed from art to education to the shared belief that children deserved to see themselves reflected in excellence. "I should get them home," Wanda said finally. "Let me help," Emery offered, and something in his tone suggested he meant more than carrying sleeping children. Present day. "So what was it about Dad that made you trust him?" Avon asked, bringing Wanda back to the present where eggs were getting cold and Sunday was waiting to unfold. "He saw you first," Wanda said, serving breakfast with the automatic grace of someone who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. "Before he even really saw me, he saw you too. He talked to you like you mattered, like your opinions were important." "Most people don't do that with kids," Celine observed with the wisdom of someone who'd experienced both dismissal and respect. "Most people see children as interruptions to adult conversation," Emery agreed, cutting his eggs with characteristic precision. "But children are the point of adult conversation. Everything we do, everything we build, it should be for them." "Is that why you became a principal?" Avon asked. "To build things for kids?" "I became a principal because I believe education is the most radical act of love," Emery replied. "Every time we teach a child that they're capable of greatness, we're challenging every system that tells them they're not." This was the philosophy that had shaped their household, not just the belief that the twins were capable of greatness, but the daily reinforcement of that truth through high expectations wrapped in unconditional love. "Speaking of greatness," Wanda said, settling into her own chair, "any word on college applications?" "MIT said they'd have decisions by Friday," Avon replied with the calm that masked her nervousness. "And Northwestern called yesterday. They want to schedule an interview." "Harvard's being mysterious," Celine added. "But my guidance counselor thinks that's a good sign." Emery reached across the table to squeeze both girls' hands. "Whatever happens, we're proud of you. You've become everything we hoped, and more than we dreamed." "Because you made us believe we could," Avon said simply. "From the very beginning you acted like our success was inevitable." "Because it was," Wanda said. "Not because success was guaranteed, but because you were raised to understand that failure isn't about falling down, it's about not getting back up." 8 years earlier, parent-teacher conference. "Mr. and Mrs. Claymore." The teacher's voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent the day trying to inspire 12-year-olds. "Thank you for coming." Emery and Wanda sat in the tiny plastic chairs that made every adult feel like they were being punished, waiting to hear about Celine's latest creative interpretation of assignment requirements. "Celine is—" Mrs. Rodriguez paused, clearly searching for diplomatic language. "Exceptionally bright. But she has very strong opinions about how learning should happen." "What did she do this time?" Wanda asked with the resignation of a mother who loved her daughter's spirit, but occasionally wished it came with an off switch. "She rewrote the ending to Romeo and Juliet," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Instead of dying, they run away to start a theater company that performs plays about conflict resolution." Emery's laugh rumbled through the classroom. "That sounds like Celine. What was the assignment?" "To write a 5-paragraph essay about theme in Shakespeare." "Did she identify the themes?" Wanda asked. "Oh yes. She identified 6 different themes and then explained how the play would be more effective if Shakespeare had developed them differently." Mrs. Rodriguez pulled out Celine's paper, covered in red ink but also adorned with a large A+. "I've never had a 12-year-old critique the bard's narrative choices with such confidence." "Should we be concerned?" Emery asked, with the gentle probing that had made him an effective principal, always seeking to understand rather than judge. "Concerned? Number prepared? Yes. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. You're raising children who think for themselves. That's going to challenge every teacher they meet from now until graduation. Good, Wanda said firmly. They should think for themselves. They should question authority. They should believe their voices matter. Present day. Remember when you rewrote Romeo and Juliet? Emery asked Celine, who was now working on her own college essays with the same creative fearlessness. That was good practice for my Harvard essay. Celine grinned. I'm writing about how traditional narratives fail young women by teaching them that love requires sacrifice instead of growth. And you, Avon? Wanda asked. What's your MIT essay about? The mathematics of social justice, Avon replied. How data analysis can identify systemic inequities and engineering can design solutions. Emery's smile could have powered the entire neighborhood. My brilliant daughters, changing the world one essay at a time. We learned from the best, Avon said, gesturing around the kitchen that had been the center of their education, in love, justice, and possibility. You learned from each other, Wanda corrected. I just provided the space and the snacks. And Dad provided the guidance and the grading, Celine added, nudging Emery's shoulder affectionately. I provided the love, Emery said simply. Everything else was just details. The simple truth of it hung in the air like a blessing. This man had walked into their lives when the twins were small and scared, had seen a ready-made family where others might have seen complications, had chosen them every day for 8 years without ever making it feel like work. So, Avon said carefully, the letter from yesterday. Is it going to change anything? Wanda considered the question while watching her family around the table, the man who'd chosen to be their father, the daughters who'd grown up secure in love, the life they'd built together from intention rather than accident. No, she said with quiet certainty, it's not going to change anything, because some people get to write the story and others just get to live in it. We're the ones writing this story. Good, Celine said, raising her orange juice like a toast, because this is the only story I want to be in. They clinked glasses. Orange juice and coffee, the simple sacrament of a family that had learned the difference between love that costs and love that gives, between men who father children and men who raise them, between the family you're born to and the family you choose to become. Outside, Detroit's Sunday morning unfolded with its own rituals of community and connection. Inside, the Claymore family continued writing their story, one breakfast, one conversation, one moment of chosen love at a time. Chapter 5. Ghosts Don't Knock. The past doesn't arrive with warning bells or dramatic music. It walks through your door wearing an expensive suit and carrying regrets too heavy for any one man to bear. Present-day Detroit. The Renaissance Tech Conference had been Christopher Slough's idea of penance, returning to the city where he'd made the worst decision of his life to lecture venture capitalists about innovation through adversity. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was teaching others to embrace risk while standing in the place where his own cowardice had cost him everything that mattered. Detroit had transformed itself while he'd been building his empire. The downtown core hummed with startups and coffee shops, young professionals who saw possibility where he'd once seen only problems. The city had learned to resurrect itself from abandonment, a lesson he was still struggling to master. He walked without destination, letting muscle memory guide him through streets that held the ghost of his marriage. The restaurant where he'd first told Wanda he loved her now housed a gallery featuring local artists. The theater where they'd shared their first date had become a community center offering job training and childcare. Everything had been rebuilt, reimagined, given new purpose. Everything except him. His phone buzzed with emails from his Chicago office, reminders of board meetings and investment opportunities that had once felt urgent, but now seemed like elaborate games played by people who'd forgotten what they were playing for. At 52, Christopher had accumulated wealth that could buy almost anything, except the ability to undo the choice that had made accumulating it pointless. That's when he saw it. Millionaire Gallery, in elegant script across a converted warehouse window, and beneath it, celebrating the African diaspora through contemporary art. His ex-wife's dream made manifest. Through the expansive windows, he could see her moving with the same grace he remembered, hanging a piece by an artist whose work pulsed with life and color, everything their sterile marriage home had never been. But this wasn't the broken woman who'd left his house 10 years ago. This was a queen surveying her kingdom, confident and radiant and completely transformed. She wore her natural hair in intricate braids that framed her face like a crown, and her movements had the assured quality of someone who'd found her purpose and claimed it completely. The gallery buzzed with visitors, families with children, couples discussing technique, older black women nodding approval at pieces that told their stories. Then he saw them. Two young women, clearly college-aged, moving through the space with easy familiarity. One was methodical in her observation, studying each piece with scientific precision. The other was more expressive, gesturing animatedly as she explained something to a younger visitor. They both had his eyes. Christopher's knees buckled slightly as mathematical certainty crashed into emotional devastation. The timeline was undeniable. These young women would be exactly the right age, born exactly when they would have been born if Wanda had been pregnant during their divorce proceedings. His daughters. The children he'd never known existed, grown into magnificent young women who moved through the world with the confidence of people who'd never doubted their worth. The methodical one looked up from a sculpture and met his gaze through the glass. For a moment, time crystallized into recognition that went deeper than logic. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same analytical intensity he'd brought to every problem he'd ever solved. Then Wanda appeared beside her, following her daughter's gaze to the window where Christopher stood frozen like a man witnessing his own resurrection. Their eyes met across 10 years and the width of the street. He saw recognition, calculation, and something that might have been pity cross her features before her expression settled into polite neutrality. She walked to the gallery door and opened it just wide enough for conversation. "Christopher." Her voice carried the same melodic quality he remembered, but tempered now with steel. "You seem to be lost." It wasn't a question. She was telling him, with perfect politeness and absolute finality, that he didn't belong in this space she'd created. Wanda. Her name felt foreign after 10 years of silence. I had no idea this was yours." "It is." Pride resonated in those two words, not defensive pride, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd turned dreams into reality through will and work. The expressive daughter appeared behind Wanda, studying Christopher with frank curiosity. "Mom? Is everything okay?" "Mom." The word hit him like a physical blow, followed immediately by the realization that this young woman, his daughter, was protecting her mother from a stranger she instinctively distrusted. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Wanda said, without taking her eyes off Christopher. "Just someone who took a wrong turn." "Actually," the methodical daughter joined them, "weren't you speaking at the tech conference?" "Christopher Slough Industries." She knew his name. His daughter knew his name, but only as a businessman, a stranger whose success had made the news. The irony was devastating. "You know who I am?" he asked, hating how desperate he sounded. "I read about innovative companies," she replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "Your AI platform has interesting applications for social justice data analysis." She was talking about his work with the clinical detachment of a student, discussing a case study, unaware that she was speaking to the man whose DNA she carried, whose intelligence she'd inherited, whose abandonment had shaped her entire existence. "I should go," he said, though every cell in his body screamed to stay, to find some way to extend this accidental connection. "Yes," Wanda agreed, gently but firmly. "You should." The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a funeral bell. Through the window, he watched his daughters return to their lives, the methodical one resuming her study of the sculpture, the expressive one continuing her animated conversation with visitors. Neither looked back, but Wanda did. She met his gaze one final time through the glass, and in her eyes he saw everything he'd lost and would never recover. The love of a woman who'd offered him her whole heart, the chance to raise children who might have grown up calling him Dad, the life he could have had if he'd chosen courage over comfort. Then she turned away, returning to the family and community and purpose she'd built from the ashes of his cowardice. That night, Chicago. Christopher sat in his penthouse office at 2 a.m., staring at search results that confirmed what his heart already knew. Social media photos of Wanda with her daughters at gallery openings, school events, family celebrations. The methodical one was Avon, clearly bound for academic excellence. The expressive one was Soline, radiating creativity and confidence, both born in February 10 years ago, 7 months after their divorce. The math was undeniable, devastating, final. Wanda had been pregnant when he'd handed her those divorce papers. She'd been carrying his children when he'd chosen his board's approval over his wife's love. She'd given birth to his daughters while he'd been celebrating the stock bump that came from streamlining his personal brand. His hands shook as he scrolled through image after image of the life he'd forfeited. Birthday parties where another man, tall, kind-faced, clearly beloved, helped them blow out candles. School plays where he sat in the front row, applauding their performances. Family vacations where all 4 of them wore matching smiles and easy affection. Emery Claymore, the school principal who'd married Wanda 5 years ago and legally adopted the girls 3 years later. The man who'd stepped into the space Christopher had abandoned and made it his own through daily love and consistent presence. The man who was their father in every way that Christopher had failed to be. His phone rang, his assistant wondering why his office lights were on so late. His board members, concerned about tomorrow's presentation. His accountant, discussing tax implications of his latest acquisition. All of it felt like noise now, meaningless static compared to the silence left by 10 years of missing his daughters' lives. He'd built an empire on the foundation of his broken marriage, had accumulated wealth that could buy almost anything except the ability to undo his greatest failure. His net worth had grown exponentially while his daughters learned to walk, talk, read, dream without ever knowing his name as anything more than a stranger from the business pages. The most successful venture capitalist in Chicago, and he'd failed to recognize the most valuable investment of his life until it was too late to matter. Present day. Wanda found the letter waiting on her doorstep the next morning, cream-colored stationery with his familiar handwriting, weighted down by a smooth stone from Lake Michigan that he'd clearly chosen with symbolic intent. She read it in her kitchen while coffee brewed and Detroit woke up around her, while her daughters slept upstairs in beds that Emery had assembled with patient care, in rooms decorated with their achievements and dreams. Wanda, I know I have no right to write this letter, no right to expect you to read it, no right to ask anything of you after 10 years of silence. But I'm asking anyway, not for myself, but for the daughters I saw yesterday in your gallery. I've spent the night doing mathematics that I should have done 10 years ago, understanding finally what my cowardice cost all of us. They're beautiful, Wanda. They're brilliant and confident and everything I never deserved to help create. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I'm writing to acknowledge what I lost, what I threw away, what I was too stupid and scared to fight for. I'm writing to tell you that seeing them yesterday, seeing the women they've become under your guidance and Emery's love, is both the most wonderful and most devastating experience of my life. I don't deserve to know them. I don't deserve to call them my daughters. I forfeited those rights when I chose money over love, when I let other people's prejudices matter more than my own family. But I want you to know that they exist in my heart now, that their faces will be the last thing I see before sleep and the first thing I think of when I wake. I want you to know that I understand finally the true cost of the choice I made. I won't contact you again. I won't disrupt the life you've built, the family you've created, the love you found. But I needed you to know that somewhere in Chicago, a broken man is grateful that his greatest failure led to your greatest triumph. Thank you for protecting them from me when they needed protection. Thank you for giving them everything I couldn't. Thank you for being everything I wasn't brave enough to be. Christopher. Wanda folded the letter carefully and placed it in her kitchen drawer next to the ultrasound photos from 10 years ago and the adoption papers that had made Emery legally what he'd always been emotionally, her daughter's father. Upstairs, she could hear the twins getting ready for school, Avon methodically organizing her day while Celine searched dramatically for her missing calculus book. Normal sounds from a normal morning in a life built on intention rather than accident. Some letters demanded responses. Others simply needed to be acknowledged and filed away, evidence of roads not taken and choices that had led to exactly where they were supposed to be. Christopher Slough had finally learned the difference between fathering children and raising them. The lesson had come 10 years too late to matter, but perhaps it was never too late for a man to understand the true cost of his choices. She made breakfast for her family, the real one, the chosen one, the one that had been built from love rather than biology, and let the past settle back into the past where it belonged. Chapter 6. The weight of what was lost. Regret is the heaviest currency in the world. You can't spend it, save it, or give it away, but it will bankrupt your soul if you carry too much for too long. Christopher Slough had been awake for 37 hours, sustained by coffee and the particular madness that comes from discovering you've spent 10 years running from the most important truth of your life. His penthouse office had become a shrine to his own failure. Printouts scattered across mahogany surfaces, laptop screens glowing with social media profiles, phone calls to investigators who specialized in the archaeology of abandoned families. The Renaissance Tech Conference was a distant memory, forgotten the moment he'd seen his daughters through that gallery window. The board meeting he'd missed had generated 17 voicemails and 43 emails, all variations on the theme of "Where the hell are you?" But Christopher had found something more important than profit margins and market projections. He'd found the life he could have lived. Detective Vincent Morrison arrived at 3 a.m. with the resigned expression of a man who'd spent 30 years watching wealthy people discover that money couldn't purchase redemption. He carried a thick folder that contained 10 years of Christopher's daughters' lives, reduced to data points and documentation. "You sure you want to know all this?" Morrison asked, settling into the leather chair across from Christopher's desk. "Sometimes ignorance is kinder than knowledge." "I need to know," Christopher said, though his hands shook as he reached for the folder. "I need to understand what I lost." Morrison opened the file with practiced efficiency. Avon Marie Claymore, 18 years old, graduating valedictorian from Cass Technical High School next month, early admission to MIT for biomedical engineering, National Merit Scholar, volunteer tutor, member of the debate team that won state championships 3 years running. Christopher studied the photograph of a young woman who looked like a feminine version of himself. Same analytical eyes, same determined jaw, same way of tilting her head when concentrating. But where his intensity had been driven by ambition, hers seemed motivated by genuine curiosity and desire to help others. "She wants to design prosthetics for children in developing countries," Morrison continued. Her senior project involved creating low-cost 3D printed limbs using recycled materials. At 18, she's already been published in 2 peer-reviewed journals. The words hit Christopher like physical blows. His daughter, and she was his daughter, the resemblance was undeniable, was already changing the world while he'd spent 18 years accumulating wealth for no purpose beyond proving he could. And the other one? Celine Grace Claymore, also 18, they're twins, born 22 minutes apart. Early admission to Harvard for creative writing and social justice. Editor of her school's literary magazine, winner of 3 national poetry competitions, organizer of a community arts program that serves underprivileged kids. The photograph showed a young woman with Wanda's grace and an infectious smile that suggested she'd never met a stranger or faced a problem she couldn't solve through sheer force of personality. She's written a collection of essays about growing up as a mixed-race woman in Detroit, Morrison added. Publishers are already interested. At 18, she's got more wisdom about identity and belonging than most people acquire in a lifetime. Christopher closed his eyes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he'd lost. Not just children, but extraordinary children. Not just daughters, but young women who were already contributing to the world in ways he'd never imagined. "Tell me about their father," he said quietly. "Their real father." Morrison's expression shifted to something approaching sympathy. Emery Claymore, 47 years old, principal of Frederick Douglass Academy for 8 years. Before that, he taught history and coached debate team, adopted the girls when they were 10 years old after marrying their mother. What's he like? By all accounts, the kind of man every child deserves and most never get. Morrison pulled out more photographs. Emery at school functions, family vacations, graduation ceremonies. He's never missed a parent-teacher conference, school play, or soccer game. He taught them both to drive, helped them with college applications, walked them through their first heartbreaks. Each detail was a knife wound, precise and devastating. While Christopher had been building his empire, another man had been building relationships with his children. While he'd been accumulating stock options, Emery had been accumulating memories. "The community loves him," Morrison continued relentlessly. "Teachers say he transformed the school from a last resort into a place where kids compete to attend. Parents say he knows every student's name and story. The girls worship him." "Show me," Christopher said masochistically. Morrison pulled out a tablet loaded with video clips, Avon's debate team victory where Emery's proud applause was audible from the recording device, Celine's poetry reading where he wiped away tears without shame, family interviews for a local news segment about successful school programs where both girls spontaneously hugged him when asked about their biggest inspiration. "He's their father," Morrison said simply. Not because of biology, but because he chose to be. Every day for 8 years, he chose to be their father. Christopher watched his daughters light up when they talked about Emery, saw the easy affection between them, witnessed the security that came from knowing you were completely loved. Everything he'd forfeited was there in those videos, the bedtime stories he'd never read, the problems he'd never helped solve, the pride he'd never earned the right to feel. "There's more," Morrison said carefully, "about why he came into their lives." "Tell me." Wanda struggled the first few years. Single mother trying to establish her gallery, raising twins while building a business. The community helped, but it was hard, really hard. Christopher's chest tightened. How hard? Food bank hard. Choosing between heat and groceries hard, working 3 jobs while the twins were in daycare hard. Morrison's voice carried the weight of truths that couldn't be softened. She never asked for help, never reached out to you or your family. Just worked herself nearly to death to provide for those girls. The revelation hit Christopher like a physical assault. While he'd been celebrating his divorce-induced stock surge, Wanda had been struggling to feed their children. While he'd been buying his second home, she'd been choosing between rent and groceries. While he'd been proving to his board that discarding his black wife was good for business, That same wife had been working multiple jobs to support the children he'd never known existed. "She could have contacted me," he said weakly. "Could have asked for support." Could she? Morrison's question carried decades of experience with men who'd abandoned families. "You just divorced her because your board found her existence inconvenient. What made you think she'd trust you with her children's welfare?" The logic was irrefutable and damning. He'd demonstrated that his love came with conditions, that his commitment had price limits. Why would she risk her children's security on a man who'd already proven he'd choose money over family? "When did it get better?" Christopher asked. "When Emery came into the picture. He didn't just marry her, he invested in the gallery, helped establish her business, provided stability for the girls. Within 2 years of their marriage, Wanda was thriving. The gallery became profitable, the twins had everything they needed, and they had a father who showed up." Christopher stared at the photographs scattered across his desk. His daughter's birthday parties, school events, family vacations, moments of joy and connection he'd forfeited before they'd even been born. "I want to see them," he said suddenly. "Not approach them, just observe them. I need to understand who they are." Morrison hesitated. "Mr. Slough, I have to advise against one observation. From a distance, I need to see my daughters living their lives." The word daughters tasted strange in his mouth, a claim he'd forfeited the right to make, but couldn't help feeling in the deepest parts of his soul. "One observation," Morrison agreed reluctantly. "But then you need to decide if pursuing this is worth the potential damage to everyone involved." 2 days later, Christopher sat in his rental car across from Cass Technical High School, watching students pour out of the red brick building like freedom made manifest. He'd positioned himself carefully, close enough to observe, far enough to remain unnoticed, hidden behind tinted windows that felt like the barrier between his life and the one he'd abandoned. His heart hammered as he scanned the crowd of teenagers looking for faces he'd only seen in photographs. Then he saw them, Avon and Celine, walking together with the easy synchronization of twins who'd never had to compete for love or attention. Avon moved with purposeful efficiency, her backpack organized, her conversation with her sister focused and intent. Celine was more animated, gesturing as she told some story that made Avon laugh, a sound Christopher had never heard but recognized as the most beautiful music he'd ever encountered. A familiar SUV pulled up to the curb, and Christopher's chest constricted as Emery Claymore emerged. Even from a distance, the man radiated the calm confidence of someone who'd found his purpose and embraced it completely. "Dad!" Celine's voice carried across the pickup area as she broke into a run, launching herself into Emery's arms with the absolute trust of someone who'd never been dropped, disappointed, or abandoned. Emery caught her effortlessly, spinning her once before setting her down and turning to embrace Avon, who approached with more dignity but equal warmth. Christopher watched his biological daughters greet the man they called father, and the love between them was so tangible it made his chest ache with recognition of everything he'd lost. "How was school, brilliant girls?" Emery's voice drifted across the parking lot, warm with genuine interest and pride. "I got my MIT acceptance letter," Avon announced with quiet satisfaction, pulling an envelope from her backpack. "And I got into Harvard," Celine added, practically bouncing with excitement. "Early admission with a partial scholarship." Christopher watched Emery's face transform with pride so pure it was almost painful to witness. This man, this stranger who'd stepped into the space Christopher had abandoned, was experiencing the joy that should have been his. These accomplishments, these moments of triumph, these children who were changing the world at 18, all of it belonged to Emery now because he'd earned it through 8 years of daily love. "That's my extraordinary daughters," Emery said, pulling both girls into a group hug that lasted long enough for Christopher to memorize every detail. "MIT and Harvard. Your mother's gonna cry happy tears. Good tears, though, Avon clarified with the slight smile that reminded Christopher painfully of himself at her age. The best tears, Emery agreed. The kind that come from watching your children become everything you hoped and more than you dreamed. As they climbed into the SUV, Christopher caught a glimpse of the interior, debate team trophies on the dashboard, family photos tucked into sun visors, the comfortable chaos of a vehicle that had transported children to countless activities and adventures. A small placard hung from the rearview mirror, "World's Greatest Dad," in Celine's distinctive handwriting. The SUV pulled away, carrying his daughters toward a home where they belonged, where they were celebrated, where their achievements would be shared over dinner with parents who'd earned the right to be proud. Christopher sat in his rental car for a long time after they disappeared, processing what he'd witnessed. These weren't children who needed rescuing or claiming. They weren't missing anything from their lives. They had everything: love, stability, support, and two parents who'd chosen them completely and consistently. That night, Detroit hotel. Christopher's phone showed 47 missed calls from his Chicago office and 83 unread emails, all variations on the theme of mounting crisis as Slough Industries functioned without its CEO for the first time in 15 years. Board meetings had been postponed, deals were stalling, and his absence was generating speculation among investors. But for the first time in his adult life, business felt like background noise compared to the symphony of regret playing in his head. He'd built an empire on the foundation of his broken marriage, had accumulated wealth that could buy almost anything except the ability to undo his greatest failure. His net worth had tripled, while his daughters learned to walk, talk, read, and dream without ever knowing his name as anything more than a stranger from the business pages. The irony was devastating. He'd divorced Wanda to protect his business interests, to appease investors who were uncomfortable with interracial leadership. But those same investors had children of their own, sons and daughters, who made all their wealth and success meaningful, who gave purpose to their accumulation. Christopher had chosen money over family and ended up with neither wealth nor love that mattered. His laptop screen showed the social media profiles he'd been studying obsessively: Avon's LinkedIn page with its impressive research publications, Celine's Instagram filled with poetry and social justice advocacy, family photos that told the story of a life lived with intention and joy. In every image, Emery was present, not as an intruder or replacement, but as the gravitational center around which their family orbited. He was the constant in equations that had solved themselves beautifully without Christopher's input. The hotel room felt suffocating, filled with the weight of 10 years' worth of missed moments. Christopher opened the windows, letting Detroit's night air carry the sounds of a city that had learned to rebuild itself stronger and more beautiful than before, just like Wanda had. Just like his daughters were doing every day, becoming the kind of people who would change the world through intelligence, creativity, and compassion, qualities they'd inherited from him, but learned to use from the man who'd actually raised them. Christopher pulled out his phone and called Morrison. "I need to know everything," he said without preamble. "Every birthday party, every school play, every moment I missed. I need to understand the life they've lived without me." "Mr. Slough," Morrison said carefully, "I have to ask, what's your end game here? What do you hope to accomplish?" Christopher stared out at Detroit's skyline, at the lights of a city that refused to stay dead, that kept reinventing itself despite abandonment and betrayal. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I just need to understand the true cost of the choice I made. Maybe I need to see what love looks like when it's not conditional on profit margins and shareholder approval. And if seeing it destroys you." Christopher considered the question while watching traffic move through streets where he'd once lived and loved and thrown away everything that mattered. Then maybe that's what I deserve, he said quietly. Maybe destruction is the price of understanding what you've lost. Present day, Chicago. 3 days later, Christopher returned to his penthouse with a folder full of his daughters' lives and the weight of complete understanding. He'd seen their school performances, read their published writing, watched video of their debate competitions and poetry readings. He'd learned about their volunteer work, their friendships, their dreams and fears, and the small daily moments that made up the texture of lives lived with purpose. They were extraordinary, not just intelligent or accomplished, but genuinely good people who'd been raised to use their gifts in service of others. Avon's prosthetics research would help disabled children around the world. Celine's writing was already opening conversations about identity and belonging for mixed-race young people who'd never seen themselves reflected in literature. At 18, they were already contributing more to the world than he had in 52 years of accumulating wealth. His office felt different now, not like a command center for an empire, but like a monument to misplaced priorities. The awards and deal announcements that had once felt like achievements now seemed like participation trophies in a game that didn't matter. His assistant knocked and entered with the stack of documents requiring his signature. Contracts worth millions, deals that would expand his influence, investments that would increase his net worth by another few percentage points. "Sir," she said when he didn't reach for the papers, "the board is waiting for your decision on the Singapore acquisition." Christopher looked at the documents, then at the photographs of his daughters scattered across his desk. Avon accepting a science award, Celine reading poetry at a community event, both of them laughing with Emery at some family dinner. "Cancel it," he said quietly. "Sir?" "Cancel the acquisition. Postpone the board meeting. Clear my schedule for the rest of the week." His assistant stared at him as if he'd announced plans to become a circus performer. Everything. Everything. Christopher stood and walked to the window, looking out at Chicago's skyline, another city that had learned to reinvent itself, though perhaps not as successfully as Detroit. "I need to figure out what's worth building and what's worth losing." After she left, Christopher sat alone with the artifacts of his daughters' lives and the growing understanding that some mistakes were so fundamental they couldn't be fixed, only learned from, mourned, and accepted as the price of choices made in fear rather than love. He'd spent 10 years building an empire on the foundation of his broken marriage. Now he had to decide if he was strong enough to let his daughters keep the family they'd built from the ashes of his failures. Some investigations revealed truths that set you free. Others revealed truths that demanded you accept the weight of what you'd lost and find a way to live with that knowledge. Christopher Slough was beginning to understand which kind of truth he'd uncovered. Chapter 7. When Wolves Circle. There are two kinds of investigations, those that seek truth and those that seek absolution. The difference is that truth accepts what it finds, while absolution demands what it wants. Present-day Detroit. The call came at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and reckoning, just as the Claymore family was settling into their evening rhythm. Keisha's voice carried the controlled urgency of a social worker who'd spent 20 years recognizing threats to children and families. "Wanda, we need to talk. Now." Wanda stepped away from the kitchen where she'd been helping Celine prepare for her Harvard interview, into the hallway where her voice wouldn't carry to daughters who didn't need to inherit her fears. "What's happened?" Mrs. Patterson called from Cass Tech. She said a man came by yesterday, claiming to be researching an article about successful Detroit families. Wanted detailed information about Avon and Celine's academic records, their activities, their family background. The words hit Wanda like ice water, flooding her system with the protective fury that had sustained her through 10 years of single motherhood and the early years of rebuilding. Someone was investigating her children. Someone was gathering intelligence about her daughters. What did she tell him? Nothing. School policy, plus her instincts were screaming. Keisha's voice carried the sharp edge of professional alarm. She asked around. He's been to the dance studio where Celine took classes as a kid, the debate team coordinator, even tried to talk to some neighbors. Professional job, but sloppy in the way desperate people get sloppy. Wanda closed her eyes, seeing the pattern with terrible clarity. Christopher hadn't just discovered their existence, he was building a case, gathering evidence, preparing for what? Custody battles, contact demands, the systematic disruption of the life they'd built without him. Mom? Avon appeared in the hallway with the perceptiveness that had marked her since childhood. You look like someone just threatened something you love. Someone did, Wanda said, then caught herself. These were 18-year-old women now, not children who needed protection from adult realities. Someone's been asking questions about you and your sister, about our family. Avon's analytical mind immediately jumped to the logical conclusion. Him, the man who helped create us but never chose to stay. It wasn't a question. Her daughter had inherited Christopher's capacity for rapid logical connections, though she'd learned to use it in service of others rather than personal gain. Probably, Wanda confirmed, I need to call your father. He's in his study, grading papers and pretending he's not nervous about our college interviews tomorrow. Avon studied her mother's face with the same intensity she brought to her research. Should we be worried? We should be prepared, Wanda replied. There's a difference. That evening, Claymore family meeting. They gathered in the living room that had been the center of their family democracy for 8 years. Every major decision discussed, every concern aired, every celebration shared in the space that Emery had carefully designed to feel like home rather than showplace. Emery sat on the couch with Celine curled beside him, her usual dramatic energy subdued by the seriousness of the moment. Avon occupied the reading chair that had been hers since middle school, while Wanda paced with the restless energy of a mother whose children were being threatened. So, Celine said with characteristic directness, our biological father has figured out we exist, and he's investigating us like we're a corporate acquisition. We don't know that's what's happening, Emery said carefully, though his voice carried the steel that had made him an effective principal. We just know someone's asking questions. Come on, Dad, Avon said gently. We're 18, not 8. We can handle the truth. Emery and Wanda exchanged the look that had sustained their marriage through 8 years of raising brilliant, strong-willed daughters, a mixture of pride, protection, and the recognition that their children were becoming adults who deserved respect, along with love. Your mother received a letter, Emery said, from Christopher Slough. He's realized certain truths about timing and biology. And now he wants to play father, Celine said, with the cutting insight that her poetry was famous for. 10 years too late and 18 years too selfish. What does he want? Avon asked, approaching the problem like the engineering challenge it was. What's his objective? Wanda pulled the letter from her pocket. She'd been carrying it like evidence of a crime, proof of her own good judgment in never trusting this man with her children's hearts. He says he doesn't want anything, she said. He says he just wanted me to know that he understands what he lost. But you don't believe him, Celine observed. I believe that's what he believes right now, Wanda replied. But I also know that men who make their living through acquisition don't usually accept loss gracefully. Keisha arrived as they were discussing options, letting herself in with her spare key and bringing the fierce protective energy that had always made her Wanda's guardian angel. At 48, She'd seen every possible family configuration and understood that love came in forms that law and tradition often failed to recognize. "How are my girls handling this?" she asked, settling into the chair that had been designated hers since she'd helped them move into this house. "Like the warriors you raised us to be," Avon replied, earning a smile from her aunt. "Good, because warriors don't retreat from threats. They prepare for battle." "What kind of battle?" Emery asked, his educator's mind already working through scenarios and contingencies. "The legal kind if he's smart," Keisha said grimly. "The emotional kind if he's desperate. The public relations kind if he's ruthless." She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. "I'm alerting my network, teachers, coaches, counselors, anyone who might be approached by investigators." "What about us?" Celine asked. "Do we just sit here and wait for him to decide how much he wants to disrupt our lives?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. These were young women who'd been raised to act rather than react, to solve problems rather than endure them. The idea of being passive victims in someone else's drama was antithetical to everything they'd been taught. "We do what strong families do," Wanda said finally. "We protect each other, we document everything, and we make it clear that our family isn't available for hostile takeover." "What if he goes to court?" Avon asked with the logical progression that made her such an effective debater. "What if he demands paternity tests and visitation rights?" "Then he'll learn that rights are earned through relationship, not biology," Emery said firmly. "I adopted you legally 3 years ago. In the eyes of the law, I'm your father. He's a stranger with a theory." "And in your eyes?" Celine asked softly. "Are we really yours?" Emery's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the quiet certainty that had anchored their family through every challenge. "You've been mine since the moment I met you. Not because of papers or legal documents, but because love doesn't need DNA to be real. You're my daughters in every way that matters." "Then we fight," Avon said simply. "If he wants to challenge our family, he'll learn what happens when you threaten something worth protecting." "We fight smart," Wanda corrected. "We document everything. We involve our lawyer. We make it clear that any attempt to disrupt your lives will be met with the full force of a community that's been protecting its own for generations." Later that night, after the twins had gone to bed, early because they had college interviews the next morning that would determine their immediate futures, Wanda and Emery sat on their back porch, sharing the silence that had sustained their marriage through every challenge. "Are you scared?" Emery asked, reaching for her hand in the darkness. "Terrified," Wanda admitted. "Not of him, but of what his presence might do to their sense of security. They've grown up knowing they're wanted, knowing they belong. What if his investigation makes them question that?" "It won't," Emery said with quiet certainty, "because we've spent 8 years proving that love is a choice we make every day. One investigation from a stranger isn't going to erase 8 years of daily commitment. But what if he pushes? What if he demands access, claims parental rights?" Emery was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same care he brought to every family decision. Then we remind him that being a parent isn't about biology. It's about showing up. It's about 8 years of homework help and bedtime stories and driving lessons and college applications. It's about earning the right to be called dad through daily acts of love. And if the courts will see what everyone else sees, Emery interrupted gently. A stable family that doesn't need fixing, children who are thriving, and a man who's trying to claim credit for work he never did. Wanda leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from the solid presence that had anchored her family for 8 years. "I should have told him about the pregnancy." "No," Emery said firmly. "You protected your children from a man who'd already proven he'd choose money over family. That wasn't cowardice. That was wisdom." Inside the house, They could hear the twins talking quietly in their shared room, the conversations that had sustained them since birth, the bond that no biological father could threaten or displace. They were discussing their interviews tomorrow, their futures, their excitement about college, and the wider world waiting for them. They were discussing their futures as young women who'd never doubted their worth, never questioned their belonging, never wondered if they were loved enough. "He can investigate all he wants," Wanda said quietly, "but he's going to discover that you can't reclaim something that was never really yours. Those girls belong to us, to each other, to this community, to the love that raised them. And to themselves," Emery added. "Most importantly, they belong to themselves. That's what we've given them, the absolute certainty that they're enough, exactly as they are." Outside, Detroit settled into its nighttime rhythm, a city that understood the importance of community, of protecting your own, of standing strong against those who would try to tear down what you'd built through love and intention. Inside, a family prepared to defend itself against the ghost of past choices, armed with 8 years of daily love and the unshakable certainty that some bonds were stronger than biology, some families were built rather than born, and some love was worth fighting for with everything you had. Christopher Slough could investigate all he wanted. He was about to learn that you couldn't buy, threaten, or claim your way into a family that had been built from choice rather than chance. Chapter 8. The Architecture of Protection. A real family doesn't just share blood or a name. It builds walls together, not to keep the world out, but to keep love in. The phone call came at exactly 9 a.m., timed with the precision of a man who'd spent decades orchestrating high-stakes negotiations. Wanda was alone in her gallery when Christopher's voice filled the space like an unwelcome ghost. "We need to have a conversation about our daughters." No greeting, no acknowledgement of 10 years' silence, just the same corporate presumption that had characterized their marriage. "We don't have daughters," Wanda replied, her voice steady as steel. "I have daughters. Emery has daughters. You have a biological connection to 2 strangers who don't know your name except from business magazines." "Wanda, please, I know I made mistakes. You made choices," she interrupted. "Deliberate, calculated choices. There's a difference." Through the gallery window, she could see Detroit waking up. Children walking to school, parents heading to work, a community that had embraced her family for 18 years. This was her territory, built from the ashes of his abandonment. "I've seen them," Christopher said. "They're extraordinary, Wanda. They're brilliant and beautiful, and everything I never deserved to help create." "Then you understand why they don't need disruption from a stranger having second thoughts." "I'm not a stranger. I'm there." "You're a sperm donor having a midlife crisis," Wanda said with surgical precision. "That's all you are. That's all you've ever been." The silence stretched between them, heavy with 10 years of unspoken truths. "Let me fix this," Christopher said finally. "Let me make amends." "There's nothing to fix," Wanda replied. "There's no broken thing here that needs your repair. There's only a family you're not part of." "I could fight for custody. I could demand paternity tests." The threat revealed the true nature of his call. This wasn't about love. It was about control. "You could try," Wanda said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "And you would lose, not because you don't share their DNA, but because you've never been their father, because Emery adopted them legally 3 years ago, because any judge would see exactly what you are, a wealthy man trying to buy his way into a complete family. Meanwhile, Frederick Douglass Academy." Emery's phone buzzed with texts as he prepared for his day. He called, making threats about custody. Then from Avon. "Someone from a law firm called the school asking about our records." The investigation was escalating. Emery called Janet Morrison, the family attorney who'd handled his adoption of the twins. Janet, it's Emery Claymore. We have a problem. 2 p.m., Hart Plaza. The twins found their parents overlooking the Detroit River, the city skyline behind them like a backdrop for every family conversation. "How did the interviews go?" Wanda asked, reading the answer in their faces. "MIT was impressed with my prosthetics research," Avon reported with characteristic understatement. "Harvard loved my poetry," Celine added, settling beside Emery. "They asked about their early admission creative writing program." "That's my brilliant daughters," Emery said, pulling them into a hug that reminded them pride came before protection in his paternal hierarchy. "Now," Avon said, "tell us what kind of war we're preparing to fight." Wanda looked at her daughters, 18 years old and sharp as razors. They deserved the truth. "Christopher Slough has hired investigators," she said simply. "He's gathering information about your lives. This morning he suggested he might pursue legal action for custody or visitation rights." "On what grounds?" Celine asked. "Biology," Emery replied. "The same biology that contributed to your existence but contributed nothing to your upbringing." "That's ridiculous," Avon said with scientific precision. "Paternal rights are established through relationship and legal recognition, not genetic connection." The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications, the telepathic bond no biological father could threaten. "What do you need us to do?" Celine asked. "Just keep being yourselves," Emery said. "Keep excelling. Don't let his investigation change how you move through the world." "And if he approaches us directly?" Avon asked. "You tell him your family is complete and his presence is unwelcome," Wanda said firmly. "You remind him he had 18 years to be a father and chose not to be." "What about the community?" Celine asked. "Let them talk," Keisha's voice interrupted as she approached. "This community has been protecting our family for 10 years. They're not stopping now because some rich man decides he wants to play daddy." She settled beside Wanda with protective energy. "I've already put the word out. Teachers, counselors, coaches, everyone knows to document any contact from investigators." 4 p.m., attorney's office. Janet Morrison's office felt like a sanctuary for families under siege. Comfortable chairs, walls covered with photographs of children she'd helped protect. "So," Janet said, reviewing her file, "we have a wealthy businessman who suddenly realized he has biological children he's never met, supported, or acknowledged, and now he wants access based purely on genetic connection. Here's what he's facing legally," Janet continued with calm authority. "The girls are 18, legal adults who can make their own decisions. He never established paternity, never paid support, never exercised parental rights. Most importantly, they were legally adopted with court approval." "So he has no legal standing?" Emery asked. "Essentially none. Even if he could prove biological paternity, which he can't without their consent, he abandoned any claims by failing to establish legal fatherhood for 18 years. Janet leaned forward. "But rich men with good lawyers can tie families up in court for years, even without real cases." "What's our best defense?" Wanda asked. "Documentation, community support, and the girls themselves," Janet smiled. "You've raised 2 extraordinary young women thriving in a stable, loving family. Any court would see that disrupting their lives now serves no one's interests except his own." 6 p.m., Claymore family dinner. They gathered around their kitchen table for comfort food. Wanda's grandmother's fried chicken, mac and cheese that could heal wounds, green beans seasoned with memories. "So we're really doing this," Celine said. "Fighting for the right to remain the family we've always been." "We're not fighting," Emery corrected. "We're simply continuing to be ourselves. Fighting implies something is at stake, but there isn't." "How can you be so sure?" Avon asked. "Because families aren't built on biology," Wanda replied. "They're built on choice, daily choice, Repeated choice, the choice to love someone even when it's difficult. We've been choosing each other for 8 years. Besides, Keisha added, this community has been choosing your family for 10 years too. They've watched you grow up loved and supported. They're not letting some outsider disrupt what they've helped build. As they moved to the living room, Celine asked, if he tries to contact us directly, what do we call him? The question challenged everything they'd established about identity and belonging. You call him Mr. Slow, Emery said firmly, because that's what he is. A stranger who happens to share genetic material. He's not your father. I'm your father. He's just a man learning the difference between biology and love 18 years too late. Good, Avon said with quiet satisfaction, because I wasn't planning to call him anything else. Outside, Detroit settled into its evening rhythm, a city that understood resilience and protecting what you'd built through intention. Inside, a family constructed from choice continued the conversation that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Christopher Slough could investigate, threaten, and throw money at lawyers. But he was about to learn that the strongest families weren't held together by biology or legal documents. They were bound by 8 years of daily love, chosen commitment, and the unshakable certainty that some bonds were forged in the fire of shared experience rather than the accident of shared genes. Chapter 9. The Final Reckoning. The most powerful confrontations aren't fought with raised voices or legal briefs. They're won with the quiet dignity of a woman who refuses to be diminished twice. Christopher arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early, choosing a corner table where he could watch the entrance and prepare himself for the conversation he'd been rehearsing for 3 sleepless nights. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was meeting his ex-wife at the same cafe where he'd once told her he loved her, back when love felt like something he could afford. He'd spent the week since their phone call in a strange, suspended state, cancelling board meetings, ignoring acquisition opportunities, letting his empire run itself while he grappled with the weight of what he'd discovered. His daughters were graduating high school in 2 weeks. His daughters were attending MIT and Harvard in the fall. His daughters had built extraordinary lives without him, and he'd spent 10 years missing every moment that mattered. Wanda entered at exactly 3 p.m., moving with the regal bearing that had first captured his attention 15 years ago. But this wasn't the young woman who'd tried to make herself smaller to fit into his world. This was a queen surveying territory she'd claimed through will and work, confident in her power and unimpressed by his wealth. She wore a tailored navy dress that made her look like she was attending a board meeting, which in a way she was. This was a negotiation for the future of her family, and she dressed accordingly. Christopher. She sat across from him with the controlled grace of someone granting an audience rather than meeting an equal. You have exactly 1 hour of my time. Thank you for coming, he said, hating how formal he sounded, how much distance existed between them now. I know you didn't have to. No, I didn't. She folded her hands on the table with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait out men's justifications. But I wanted you to understand something before you pursue whatever legal fantasy you're constructing. He'd prepared a speech about regret and redemption, about wanting to know his daughters and make amends for his failures. But looking at her now, at the woman who'd transformed his abandonment into her independence, the words felt inadequate and selfish. They don't know, do they? He asked instead. About me. About the real reason you never told them. They know everything they need to know, Wanda replied with steel wrapped in silk. They know their biological father wasn't ready to be a parent. They know some people aren't brave enough for the love they're offered. They know they're better off without someone who would abandon them for social approval. Each word was precisely aimed, delivered with surgical accuracy. She wasn't angry. Anger would have given him something to work with. She was simply stating facts, and the facts were devastating. I was young and scared. You were 34 years old, Wanda interrupted. Old enough to know better, old enough to choose courage over cowardice, old enough to fight for what you claimed to love. I've changed, Christopher said desperately. I've learned. You've learned what? Her voice carried the particular patience reserved for slow children and obtuse men. That abandoning your pregnant wife was wrong? That choosing money over family has consequences? That some bridges burn so completely there's nothing left to rebuild? The coffee shop buzzed with afternoon energy around them. Students studying, couples planning futures, families sharing ordinary moments that Christopher had forfeited the right to experience. Everything felt normal, except this conversation, this reckoning with choices that couldn't be undone. I saw them, he said quietly, at their school. They're extraordinary, Wanda. They're everything I never deserved to help create. Yes, they are, she agreed with quiet pride. They're brilliant and confident and kind. They're going to change the world because they've been raised to believe they can. They've never doubted their worth because they've never had to justify their existence to someone who saw them as liabilities. I want to know them, Christopher said, the words falling like stones into still water. I want to be part of their lives, to help them, to support them. You want to claim credit for work you never did, Wanda said with devastating clarity. You want to feel like a father without having earned the title through 18 years of daily love. That's not, I just want, you want absolution, she continued relentlessly. You want to ease your conscience by pretending that biology creates obligation, but here's what you don't understand. They already have a father. They have a man who chose them when you chose money. They have someone who earned their love through presence, not genetics. Christopher felt something break inside his chest, not just regret, but the final death of hope he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. So what do I do? How do I live with knowing what I lost? For the first time since she'd sat down, Wanda's expression softened slightly. Not with forgiveness, but with something that might have been pity. You live with it the same way I lived with your abandonment, she said quietly. You build a life from what remains. You find purpose in something beyond your own regret. You accept that some mistakes are so fundamental they can't be fixed, only learned from. And my daughters. They're not your daughters, Christopher. They're Emery's daughters. They're my daughters. They're their own women who will make their own choices about love and family and belonging. She gathered her purse with the finality of someone ending a business meeting. You can't reclaim what you never actually possessed. What if I don't accept that? The question came out more threatening than he'd intended. What if I pursue legal options? Wanda's smile was sharp as winter wind. Then you'll learn what happens when you threaten something worth protecting. You'll discover that Detroit's black community doesn't abandon its own to accommodate rich men's guilty consciences. You'll find out that 18 years of love creates bonds stronger than any legal claim you might imagine you have. She stood with the grace of a woman who'd won every round of a fight she'd never wanted to have. You had your chance to be their father, Christopher. You chose your board's approval instead. Now they have a real father, one who earned the title through daily devotion rather than biological accident. Wanda, please, I'm going to leave now, she said with quiet finality. And you're going to let this fantasy die? Because the alternative is learning how far a mother will go to protect her children from a stranger who thinks DNA creates entitlement. She walked away without looking back, leaving Christopher alone with his regrets and the growing understanding that some doors, once closed, could never be reopened. Through the window, he watched her climb into a sensible SUV. Probably the same one Emery used to drive their daughters to school, to activities, to all the moments that made up the texture of a life lived with intention and love. That evening, Claymore family dinner. Wanda arrived home to find her family in their usual Sunday evening configuration, Emery grading papers at the kitchen table while the twins worked on college preparation, the comfortable chaos of people who'd learned to share space without stepping on each other's dreams. "How did it go?" Avon asked without looking up from her MIT orientation materials. "Like putting a ghost to rest," Wanda replied, settling into her chair with the relief of someone who'd fought her final battle with the past. He understands now that wanting something doesn't create the right to have it. "Good," Celine said firmly, "because we have Dad, and we have you, and we have each other. We don't need anything else." "What did you tell him?" Emery asked, reaching across the table to squeeze Wanda's hand. "The truth. That families are built through choice, not accident. That love is earned through presence, not genetics. That he had 18 years to be a father and chose to be a stranger instead. And if he doesn't accept that?" Avon pressed with the logical progression that would serve her well in engineering. "Then he'll learn what every other threat to this family has learned." Keisha's voice carried from the doorway, where she'd arrived for Sunday dinner with the perfect timing that had sustained their sisterhood for 40 years. "That we protect our own." The conversation flowed around the table as they shared the meal Wanda had prepared with extra care, comfort food that tasted like security, like belonging, like the certainty that some bonds were stronger than biology and some families were worth fighting for with everything you had. "So, it's over?" Celine asked as they cleared dishes together, the ritual that had marked the end of family dinners for 8 years. "It's over," Wanda confirmed. "Some ghosts only need to be acknowledged once before they can rest." 10 p.m. Christopher's hotel room. Christopher sat in his Chicago hotel room staring at his phone where he'd drafted and deleted 17 different messages to Wanda, each one a variation on themes of regret and desperation that she'd already made clear she wouldn't accept. The conversation had gone exactly as he should have expected from a woman who'd survived his abandonment and built something beautiful from the wreckage. She'd given him no quarter, no hope, no possibility that his belated recognition of what he'd lost could translate into any kind of relationship with the daughters he'd forfeited. His laptop showed the email drafts he'd written to Avon and Celine, introductions to children who didn't need introducing to anyone, explanations for choices that couldn't be explained, apologies for abandonment that couldn't be forgiven because it had never been acknowledged as injury. They were graduating in 2 weeks, starting college in 3 months, building lives that had no space for a stranger's regrets or a rich man's guilty conscience. Detective Morrison knocked and entered with the resignation of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The investigation is over," Morrison said simply. "There's nothing more to find. They're exactly what they appear to be, 2 extraordinary young women raised by people who love them completely. And legally, you have no standing, no claim, no right to contact them, see them, or disrupt their lives in any way." Morrison settled into the chair across from Christopher's bed. "Even if you could prove paternity, they're legal adults who can make their own choices about contact, and they've made it clear through their mother that they have no interest in knowing you." Christopher closed his laptop, shutting down the fantasy that had sustained him for 2 weeks. "So what do I do now?" "You go back to Chicago," Morrison said gently. "You run your business. You find a way to live with the knowledge that somewhere in Detroit, 2 remarkable young women are thriving without you because of choices you made 10 years ago. And if I can't live with that?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the weight of 30 years spent watching people grapple with the consequences of their choices. "Then you learn that some prices are too high to pay," he said finally, "and some lessons come too late to matter." Outside the hotel window, Detroit hummed with its evening rhythm, a city that had learned to rebuild itself from abandonment, that understood the difference between what was lost and what could be saved. Inside, a man who'd spent 10 years accumulating wealth finally understood that he'd bankrupted himself in the only currency that mattered. Christopher Slough would return to Chicago in the morning, to his empire and his empty penthouse and the life he'd chosen over love. And in Detroit, his daughters would continue becoming the extraordinary women they'd always been destined to be, raised by a father who'd earned the title through daily devotion and a mother who'd transformed abandonment into independence. Some stories end with reconciliation. Others end with the wisdom to know when reconciliation isn't possible, when the damage is too deep and the time is too late, when the greatest love is accepting what you've lost and letting it remain beautiful in the hands of those who truly deserve it. Chapter 10. What Love Costs. What Love Builds. The measure of a life isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you leave behind. And sometimes the greatest gift is knowing when to leave nothing at all. Present day, Chicago. Christopher Slough stood in his penthouse office at 3:17 a.m., surrounded by the artifacts of an empire built on the foundation of a broken marriage. Outside, Chicago's skyline glittered with the promises that money could buy, penthouses and private jets, influence and access, everything except the ability to undo the choice that had made accumulating it all pointless. On his desk lay 2 letters. The first was a legal brief his attorney had prepared, 47 pages of arguments for why he should be granted visitation rights, why his biological connection should supersede their adoptive father's legal claims, why the courts should disrupt a stable family to accommodate his newfound paternal instincts. The second was handwritten on cream-colored stationery, words that had taken him 6 hours to find and 30 years to understand. He'd returned from Detroit that morning, knowing the truth that Wanda had tried to spare him during their coffee shop confrontation. His daughters didn't need him, hadn't missed him, and were thriving specifically because of his absence, rather than despite it. They called another man Dad, with the easy affection of children who'd never doubted their security. They carried another man's name with pride earned through daily love rather than biological accident. Detective Morrison had delivered the final truth with professional efficiency. You can't claim credit for work you never did. You can't buy your way into love that was built without you, and you can't make yourself essential to people who were raised to be complete without you. The choice before him was simple and devastating. He could pursue legal action, spend hundreds of thousands on lawyers, drag his daughters through the trauma of custody battles and paternity tests. He might even win some form of court-ordered contact, supervised visits with young women who would see him as the stranger who'd disrupted their senior year, the intruder who'd threatened their sense of security just as they were preparing for college. Or he could accept that some mistakes were so fundamental they couldn't be fixed, only learned from. He could find a way to love his daughters enough to leave them alone. 6 a.m., Detroit. The letter arrived with the morning mail, delivered by a postal service that had carried promises and heartbreak through Detroit's neighborhoods for generations. Wanda found it on her front porch as she retrieved the newspaper, recognizing Christopher's handwriting immediately, but feeling no urgency to read what he had to say. Inside, her family was preparing for another ordinary day in the life they'd built together. Emery was making his famous weekend pancakes while the twins packed for their senior trip, a celebration they'd earned through 4 years of academic excellence and community service. The kitchen hummed with the comfortable chaos of people who'd learned to share space without stepping on each other's dreams. "Letter from your secret admirer?" Celine asked, with the irreverent humor that had carried her through 18 years of confident joy. "Letter from someone who's finally learned the difference between wanting something and deserving it," Wanda replied, slipping the envelope into her apron pocket. Some conversations required careful timing, and this one could wait until her daughters were safely on their way to celebrating futures he'd had no part in building. 3 hours later, empty house. With the twins departed for their senior trip and Emery at school preparing for graduation ceremonies, Wanda finally opened Christopher's letter in the kitchen that had been the center of her family's life for 8 years. Wanda, I'm writing this at 3 a.m. because it's the only time I can see clearly enough to understand what I need to say. I'm returning to Chicago this morning and I won't contact you or the girls again. Not because lawyers told me I have no legal standing, but because I've finally learned the difference between biology and love, between fathering children and raising them. I spent this week investigating your lives, gathering evidence for a custody claim I'll never file. What I found was everything I threw away and could never deserve to reclaim. I found 2 extraordinary young women who are changing the world at 18 because they were raised by people who taught them they could. I found a family built on choice rather than chance, love rather than obligation, daily devotion rather than genetic accident. I found everything I could have had if I'd been brave enough to choose love over money 10 years ago. I'm establishing education trusts for Avon and Celine, enough to pay for graduate school, research projects, whatever dreams they choose to pursue. The only condition is that they never know where the money came from. Let them think it's a scholarship, a grant, anything except the guilt offering of a man who forfeited his right to love them. I won't disrupt their graduation, their college plans, or their sense of security. I won't claim credit for their achievements or try to buy my way into their affection. I won't contact them until they're adults old enough to understand the complexity of what happened between us, and even then, only if they choose to seek me out. Thank you for protecting them from me when they needed protection. Thank you for giving them everything I couldn't. Thank you for being everything I wasn't brave enough to be. I hope someday they understand that walking away from them is the most loving thing I've ever done. Christopher, tell Emery that he's the father I never had the courage to become. Tell him that raising my daughters makes him a better man than I could ever be. Wanda read the letter twice, feeling something that might have been closure settle in her chest, like snow covering old wounds. This was what redemption looked like, not dramatic gestures or legal battles, but the quiet recognition that some love was best expressed through absence. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her kitchen drawer, next to the ultrasound photos from 18 years ago and the adoption papers that had made Emery legally what he'd always been emotionally. Evidence of roads not taken and choices that had led to exactly where they were supposed to be. Later that day, Frederick Douglass Academy. Emery was reviewing graduation speeches when his phone buzzed with a text from Wanda. It's over. He's going back to Chicago. He finally understands what we've known all along. Relief flooded through him, not because he'd feared losing his daughters to a stranger's belated claims, but because the threat to their sense of security was finally lifting. Avon and Celine could graduate and head to college without the shadow of biological disruption hanging over their achievements. His phone rang immediately, Wanda calling from the gallery where she was preparing for the twins' graduation party. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like a father whose children are safe," Emery replied simply. "Like a man who doesn't have to share the title he earned through 18 years of daily love." "He asked me to tell you something," Wanda said carefully. "He said raising his daughters makes you a better man than he could ever be." Emery was quiet for a long moment, processing the strange gift of recognition from a man he'd never met, but whose failures had made Emery's happiness possible. "They were never his daughters," he said finally. "They've been mine since the moment I chose them. Biology doesn't make you a father. Love does. Showing up does. Being there for every moment that matters does." 2 weeks later, graduation day. The ceremony took place in Detroit's Orchestra Hall, the same venue where Wanda had once attended concerts during her marriage to Christopher, back when culture felt like something you consumed rather than created. Now she sat in the audience watching her daughters receive diplomas and awards, surrounded by the community that had helped raise them. Avon graduated valedictorian with early admission to MIT's biomedical engineering program and a full scholarship funded by an anonymous donor, money that would allow her to pursue her dream of creating affordable prosthetics for children in developing countries. Her speech about engineering justice received a standing ovation from an audience that had watched her grow from a quiet 10-year-old into a young woman ready to change the world. Celine graduated salutatorian with early admission to Harvard's creative writing program and a collection of published poetry that was already generating interest from major publishers. Her graduation speech about the power of chosen family moved several audience members to tears, including the father who'd chosen her rather than simply fathering her. Emery sat between Wanda and Keisha, his face radiant with the pride that could only come from watching children you'd raised become everything you'd hoped and more than you'd dreamed. These were his daughters in every way that mattered, not because of biology, but because of 8 years of homework help and driving lessons, college applications and heartbreak comfort, daily acts of love that had built bonds stronger than genetics. "Look at them," Keisha whispered as the twins crossed the stage. "Look at these magnificent women we raised." "We did good," Wanda replied, squeezing both Emery's hand and her sister's. "We did real good." 6 months later, Christmas morning. The Claymore house hummed with holiday energy as Avon and Celine returned from their first semester of college. MIT and Harvard had treated them well, confirming everything their family had always known about their potential. They'd both received anonymous scholarship supplements that covered not just tuition, but research opportunities, study abroad programs, and graduate school funding that would carry them through whatever futures they chose to build. "Someone really believes in us," Avon observed as she showed her family the latest scholarship notification, funding for a summer research program in Rwanda where she'd helped design low-cost medical devices for rural clinics. "Someone believes in justice," Celine added, displaying her own notification about a fellowship that would fund her graduate studies in social justice literature. "Someone understands that investing in our dreams helps change the world." Wanda and Emery exchanged the look that had sustained their marriage through every challenge, a mixture of pride, protection, and the knowledge that their daughter's success was the best possible outcome of choices made in love rather than fear. They didn't know about Christopher's letters to various scholarship foundations, his anonymous donations that would follow their daughters through graduate school and beyond. They didn't need to know that somewhere in Chicago, a man was finding redemption through the only gift he could give, the absence that allowed their family to flourish without interruption. "Merry Christmas, my beautiful family," Emery said as they gathered around the tree that held 18 years' worth of ornaments, handmade decorations from elementary school, photos from family vacations, the accumulated artifacts of a life lived with intention and joy. "Merry Christmas, Dad," both girls replied, the title carrying the weight of earned affection rather than biological accident. Outside, Detroit's Christmas morning unfolded with its own rhythms of community and connection, families gathering to celebrate whatever configuration of love they'd managed to build in a world that didn't always make it easy. Inside, the Claymore family continued writing their story. One holiday, one conversation, one moment of chosen love at a time. Epilogue, 5 years later. Dr. Avon Claymore's prosthetic devices were now being used in 12 countries. Her innovative designs featured on magazine covers that inspired other young engineers. She'd never known that her anonymous funding came from a man in Chicago who tracked her achievements through news articles. Celine Claymore's debut novel about identity and belonging had won the National Book Award, her writing opening conversations that helped young people see themselves reflected in literature. She'd built a platform for social justice advocacy, funded by anonymous grants that arrived precisely when needed. Both women spoke frequently about their father, the high school principal who taught them that love was a choice made daily. Neither had ever expressed curiosity about their biological origins, secure in the knowledge that the family that raised them was the only family that mattered. In Chicago, Christopher Slough had gradually liquidated his empire, donating billions to educational foundations that would carry his daughter's work forward without his name attached. He'd learned to find purpose in anonymous service. He died peacefully at 67, leaving behind a foundation that would fund innovative engineering and social justice writing for generations. His obituary mentioned his business achievements but said nothing about the daughters he'd loved enough to leave alone. Wanda read about his death in the newspaper, feeling something that might have been peace. She showed the obituary to Emery, who placed it in the same drawer where they kept the twins' childhood photographs and adoption papers. "Should we tell them?" he asked. "Someday," Wanda replied, "when they're ready to understand that some love is best expressed through absence." Their daughters were too busy building the futures their real father had prepared them for, changing the world with confidence that came from being raised by people who'd chosen them completely. Christopher Slough had finally learned the difference between fathering children and being a father. It had taken him 67 years to understand what Emery Claymore had known from the moment he'd first met two 10-year-old girls, that love isn't about claiming what's yours, but about choosing what's right. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to be whole without you.